what's been lost over the course of the pandemic and into this time that we're in right now are the cultural connections, the bonds that you can make with other people. And there is a desire from most, not everyone, but from most people, to feel a connection to others. I think that is giving opportunity for us to not only think about how we create those connections inside an office space, but also how do we create those connections for people who are permanently remote and it's not realistic for them to come into the office regularly. So we're starting to think about this more inclusively and really trying to foster connections between people that ultimately lead to higher retention, being able to attract employees because you're working for a company that provides flexibility, but at the same time, you don't feel isolated.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leading From Afar, a show by remote leaders for remote leaders, where we dive into the most important topics facing leaders in the future of work. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz. I was the first hire at Envision, one of the first all-remote companies back in 2012. I've since helped build and scale multiple remote teams as an early employee or consultant. In each episode, we geek out doing deep dives on specific topics like within async, hiring the best talent anywhere, how to create a fun and engaging environment remotely, and so much more. This show was created to help managers leading remotely upskill themselves to help them build world-class remote cultures. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, share it with friends and colleagues, and feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into today's show of Leading From Afar. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz. Today I'm joined by Franco Castaldini, the general manager of HiFive. And HiFive is actually a product that's been incubated by Siemens, the global conglomerate, initially trying to help solve questions and issues they've faced themselves around employee engagement that really found its legs in the new hybrid work standard that has kind of taken over. Products like HiFive get me really excited because they look to solve the burning question of why the heck should I actually go into a workspace? I can attest to this, as pre-pandemic, I used to go into Tel Aviv and Jerusalem once every other week to mentor startups. And really, if I only had one or two meetings that day, it really isn't and never was worth the 60-minute commute each way. In this episode, we dove into what HiFive has been seeing around office utilization for all the companies that they work with, how companies are thinking or already redesigning office spaces, and why and who and when colleagues are coming in is the most crucial point in the future of hybrid. So if you're leading a hybrid team or a company and stuck on how to increase engagement within your team without forcing people back into the office, then this episode is absolutely for you. Hey, Franco, thanks for joining today. How's everything with you?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me today. Really enjoy the opportunity to get to know you and to talk about hybrid work.
Yeah, excited. It's a topic that we've covered quite a bit across season 2 and probably most of season 2, but I think a little bit this season as well. And something obviously we're going to cover in the future because it is probably the biggest standard of work these days, more so than obviously fully remote. And we'll kind of dive into that as we go forth. Where are you calling in from today?
I am calling in from Santa Clara, California, where we're having a rare rainy day.
Oh, all right. That's definitely good.
Yeah,
awesome.
We need the rain.
Absolutely. It's is there a certain time of year, I'm assuming outside of summer, that tends to be like the fire season? Because you always unfortunately hear about the fires in Northern California.
Yeah, thankfully this past year, we didn't have much of a fire season with the exception of our summer. But compared to the previous 2 or 3 years, this year was thankfully not as bad. So And we're getting some early rain, which is great. I had to drive into the office today.
In the rain.
Talk about hybrid work. And driving into the office when it's rainy in California can be a bit of a challenge.
I remember a few times when I was more in San Diego, and when it once in a time rained down there, just like the chaos, like people had no idea how to drive in the rain. So assuming it's probably somewhat similar. And yeah, I guess we'll probably dive into the idea of flexibility, right? And this is a great use case, right? It's raining. You don't really want to go outside and drive the rain, like how that flexibility kind of comes into play when people are choosing or they don't get to choose. But we'll get there. We'll get there. So usually the way that we start each one of the episodes, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about the origin story and the backstory of HiFive.
Yeah, so I've had a 20 plus year career in enterprise software, spanning everything from how you leverage data to be able to improve outcomes for your customers, to creating applications that provide end user value. And more recently, in the last 6 years, I've been focused on the workplace. And this was even prior to the pandemic, building applications that helped corporations create greater connection between their employees and the space that they provide. Then the pandemic hit us all, and that unfortunate experience had this interesting and positive benefit to changing the way that people work forever. And when I think back at the beginnings of the pandemic to where we are right now, the transformations that have occurred just in that time period, as well as the uncertainty ahead of us, create such an interesting problem space for us to try to figure out how do we deliver value that ultimately goes back to helping people make in real life connections with each other now that space and time is more fluid. And how do you also create those connections in space that corporations are paying for? And that space could be their HQ, but it also can be satellite spaces. And we're also looking at even more flexible definitions of what we mean by space, when ultimately it's more important that we help facilitate people coming together. So that was the impetus of the idea behind HiFive. We wanted to create an application that ultimately made it easier for people to make in real life connections when their preferences on an individual basis were so different when they would like to come into the office, for what reasons, what do they want to accomplish while they're there. And we started to look at how we could build a tool that would ultimately make it effortless for people to make those in real life connections, while at the same time providing a personalized experience for them. And that's been what we've been focused on building and learning from our users and iterating. And we're really excited about how an application like HiFive can really contribute to helping bring people together in real life, given that everyone's schedule is different these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that opens a few questions that I have. I think the first maybe we want to start is we spoke offline, and I know we've spoken about before that the product of HiFive was actually, I guess, an idea incubated through Siemens. So you, I guess, properly work for Siemens, the company, right? The large, I would always thought Siemens is an electronic company, a medical equipment company. But the fact, I think, like they're also in the employee engagement experience type space is quite interesting, even maybe just building it internally. But would love to even maybe hear some of the backstory of like how that idea came about, maybe through the pandemic, saying, hey, we really need something here again. Like maybe kind of I'll open up my first question is probably related. We've seen a lot of companies trying to push this return to office, different types of models, 3-2, full-time. Elon Musk is probably the most famous one recently. But learning pretty quickly that their employees aren't exactly so keen about the idea of returning to office or being forced to have to return to an office a certain amount of times. And there's obviously lots of data saying that almost 90% of employees expect flexibility in where and when they work and how that kind of fits into play. So maybe as we kind of maybe bridge this question I had before, maybe with this of, what was Siemens return to office policy? And I guess during the pandemic or post-pandemic-ish, and has it changed since implementing, or has it changed since getting feedback through the company and also through using this product internally before rolling it out?
Yeah, so Siemens acquired a company back in 2018 called Comfy. I was actually originally hired by Comfy, which is a fully owned business unit of Siemens. And Comfy was in the business of providing a workplace experience application. It started off as a temperature control application that made it possible for people inside of a building to control their environment, and evolved over the years to provide other use cases like desk and room booking as probably being the most common use case that we come across these days. But what we realized with Comfy was that the need to reserve a desk ahead of coming into the office wasn't necessarily solving the complete picture of the issues that were preventing upstream of making a desk reservation. Those issues were upstream and preventing people from ultimately deciding to come into the office. And since Siemens is, a large portion of its business is to serve office buildings, the need to understand how we can motivate people to utilize office space more regularly by making the value of coming into the office so apparent, that yet while at the same time, on the flip side of that equation, making the effort to figure that out really easy, was really important to Siemens and its core business of serving its corporate real estate customers. Because the last thing that Siemens or anybody any business in the corporate real estate market wants is underutilized space. But that's what we have today. And, I think Siemens, just like any other corporation, adopted policies early on, and for Siemens in their case, guidances, if you will, on how often people should be expected to come into the office. And it was a high-level guidance. The CEO of Siemens, Roland Busch, said that employees should aim to come in 3 days a week. And that policy was actually, well, I wouldn't even call it a policy, it was more of a guideline, was shared with its employees, midway through the pandemic, call it 2021. And that guideline still exists. The guideline is still 3 days a week. However, what Siemens did, as many other companies have done, have empowered their people managers, their team leaders, to figure out what's best for their team. With the guideline, or maybe the aspiration of trying to come into the office 3 days a week. That hasn't necessarily resulted in the utilization of space that a company like Siemens wanted by setting this guideline for their employees. And that's because the effort to decide whether to come into the office, the reasons why you would come into the office, that would be different than just staying at home or working from anywhere else, was too high. It was too difficult to figure out for many people to, what day should I come in, for what reason, who else is going to be there, and ultimately create an experience where they're not sitting in front of their computer in the office when they could be doing that somewhere else, and have avoided the time and effort to come into the office. So the effort has been too high, and the facilitation of making the value of coming into the office and creating a good experience for people for when they are in the office was also challenging for many team managers to coordinate. It was just too much effort for those team managers to figure out, well, how do I make it so apparent that for everyone on my team, that when they come into the office, they know what kind of experience they're going to have that's going to provide a value added benefit on a regular basis, week after week, when time and space is so fluid. And that's where we've centered HiFive around, is to really focus on making those matches while at the same time making it very easy to do that. And we've been testing it internally and been getting a great feedback and response. What we ultimately do is collect people's individual preferences, everything from what days of the week they like to come in, who do they like to meet with, who are their favorite colleagues, followers, or maybe if they're open to other connections outside of their immediate group, how do we infer those connections to create more in real life connections between colleagues that they might not otherwise experience, because we tend to work in silos. And we collect these preferences, and then we are able to create very relevant recommendations for each employee that's personalized. And that method of facilitating in real life connections really starts to address the upstream problems that were preventing people from venturing outside of their homes or outside of their normal comfort areas of work. And that's starting to show that we can start to understand people's behaviors, and understanding employee preferences, behaviors, reasons for coming in, the people who they connect with on a regular basis, the space that they use for the purposes that they're coming into the office for, is extremely valuable data when it's combined with actual space utilization data, which is a big part of our business, understanding how space is being used through sensor technology and other systems that we provide as a business. And so that's really the motivation for Siemens to continue to invest in workplace experiences, to have this opportunity of bridging the understanding of people's behaviors in connection with space.
There's a lot to unpack from what you said.
Yeah.
It seemed in a very common answer of, we've seen space utilization 20, 30 something percent. So I'm making an assumption, if you can confirm, please do, that probably space utilization Siemens in a different office is probably similar. And the idea, again, of giving guidelines or rules and trying to kind of nudge people back in, it's having to change the mindset, and is what the product is doing, and what it seems like Siemens and certainly HiFive understand. Why are people coming in, right? I know Simon Sinek, I know famous book, Start With Why. Like, that's the biggest question now. Why should there be a space? We've clearly understood, hey, we can work fantastically and be extremely productive working from home or a coffee shop or wherever that wants to be. What's the reason for coming to the office, right? It's certainly not doing work, right? Those days are over. When the cloud came around, we didn't need computers the size of a room. We didn't need physical keyboards or typewriters, right? We could work with a device and an internet connection. So the purpose of the office is no longer for doing work. And it's great to hear that obviously a significantly large conglomerate really understand this and is incubating this product of how do we shift that. And I'm fascinated to kind of watch the journey to see what data is found and what changes to the office space are made. I'm a big believer that, especially with maybe 30% utilization, right? Take the 70% that's not being utilized and convert it into fun areas, or like a real kind of crazy idea. It's make it to like residential area. Again, there's probably legal things and codes and things that would have to be changed, but I mean, the whole idea is return to the office. So you're living away from the office. We want you to return to the office. And the number one benefit of remote work year after year, it doesn't matter what survey you look at, is always no commute. So maybe taking that idea of, hey, if we have our hands tied with the space, maybe bringing the actual people to live in that space and at least utilize the space that we're in. But that's maybe we'll dive into a little bit later. But we'd love to know, I guess, maybe if you can share more insight into what the data looks like so far and the lessons learned to date from, I think, within Siemens and maybe any other companies who may be using HiFive, what lessons you've learned, kind of what you're finding, what the preferences are. Are people preferring to come in set days, or is it very much on, I'm not coming in unless I know there's people coming in? You know, what have you learned so far?
Well, knowing who's coming into the office is one of the critical inputs for anyone making a decision on whether they should join, and giving the opportunity for people to essentially follow each other in the context of the office. Think about it as, I've got my favorite coworkers who I like to meet with. And that tends to be the biggest motivation for why somebody would want to also come to the office, is knowing when their favorite coworkers are coming in. So that's been validated. We've got great input on knowing that that's a big motivation for people to come in. The other motivation is more cultural, in that it's important regardless of how people can work productively today. Yes, we can be productive from home. We can be productive from anywhere in the world to get our work done. When I say our, I'm talking each individual. But as a team, as a company, as an organization, what's been lost over the course of the pandemic and into this time that we're in right now are the cultural connections, the bonds that you can make with other people. And there is a desire from most, not everyone, but from most people, to feel a connection to others. And I think that is giving opportunity for us to not only think about how we create those connections inside an office space, but also how do we create those connections for people who are permanently remote and it's not realistic for them to come into the office regularly. So we're starting to think about this more inclusively in really trying to foster connections between people that ultimately lead to higher retention, being able to attract employees because you're working for a company that provides flexibility, but at the same time, you don't feel isolated. You don't feel alone. And I think that's a really important point, is we've become maybe a little bit lonely through the pandemic, working from home more regularly. And I think there's a desire for people to connect in person. The other thing that we've learned is that most human beings like routines. And if you can establish a routine that ultimately creates an experience that delivers value to that individual. So I like to come into the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's, how I've kind of coordinated things with my home life. There's an understanding then with my kids, and when they come home from school, is dad going to be home? My wife knows that I try to come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then that also creates an understanding and expectation with others in the workplace of when Franco comes into the office. And so establishing routines, but then giving them the flexibility to manage that on a week-by-week basis, while at the same time surfacing recommendations with connections, meeting types, the kind of the week-to-week management of your week, where it's not something where it's thought of as hybrid, but it begins to flow together, where my personal life and my professional life become one. And the coordination of that, as well as being able to create connections between others becomes seamless. And that is something else that we've validated, is that this fluidity, while at the same time providing an effortless approach to creating routine and communicating intentions across each individual and surfacing that up to the team manager to understand how their employees are working, is really, that's the crux of what we're trying to achieve here, is to create flow on a week by week basis for every person, and to align that with each individual to create the cultural connections that ultimately create an environment that people enjoy, have a high satisfaction with.
Absolutely. The biggest issue from every one of the status of remote reports, not including the pandemic, because I don't think any of that data is irrelevant, has always been loneliness, of people missing that connection. And I think there's a lot of different types of loneliness. I remember when I started 11 years ago, building one of the first all remote companies, I felt like 3 different unique types of loneliness. So what exactly loneliness means? But an argument I always make when people try to talk about the office is the office doesn't make culture. And the fact that, yes, people need in real life interactions, and you talk to anyone who's been doing this long enough, we are always very supportive of the idea of getting the team or individuals together as often as humanly possible. But that doesn't necessarily need to be at the central headquarters. But the kind of the message that I picked up from what you're saying, then what I really love to hear is the idea of the flexibility, like giving everyone has the flexibility, right? Whether you want routine is always good, because that definitely helps people. And setting those expectations. I mean, I've started to go back into Tel Aviv. Starting yesterday was my first day. Every other week, I'm planning to go in. It was something that I used to do before the pandemic, like every other week, was going to meet with startups and meet with people. And it would, like, the big decision maker was like, hey, did I have enough meetings that day? Like, if I only had 1 meeting, or maybe 2 meetings, like, it really wasn't worth the hour bus ride to get there, knowing that I had enough people to meet. Like, that was the big motivating factor. And I think that's the beautiful idea of the product. It's to give you that sense of, okay, maybe I have an idea of coming in 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and these are kind of the days. But okay, in this week, nobody's going to be in there, so maybe I'll switch a day, or maybe only work 1 day this week or 2 days. So I think that's a beautiful idea that, again, it's very much focused around the idea of flexibility. From what you're seeing in the space of obviously hybrid remote, and you've kind of been living this through your time there, are companies looking to keep employees working from a central headquarters? Or again, I know we started off with this, or are they starting to think more on the idea of a local option? I'm very much of a believer in the idea of the central headquarters is dead. Because I don't care what you offer, you can have amenities and massages and chefs and all those things. If I got to commute an hour, 60 minutes, it's 60 minutes, it's 60 minutes. I don't want a 60-minute commute regardless of what you're giving me. I know Standard Chartered in the UK made a deal with Regis, IWG, I did something to replace their central headquarters with micro spaces, whatever the most local spaces to each individual. They can choose to work there. But from what you're seeing it through, obviously, Siemens and companies who are testing out and using HiFive, what are you seeing so far? What are you hearing? Is there still that fixed idea we got to get everyone back to one central location, kind of regardless of 2 days, 3 days flexibility? Or are people starting to think more in the terms of, hey, this whole commute thing, that's the problem, or that's a big problem. So how do we try to solve that by maybe getting closer to the individual employees?
I think where we stand today, most corporations, so heads of HR, heads of real estate, are thinking about trying to bring people back into their HQ. I agree with you. I don't think it's sustainable. I think that, I'll give you an example. One of our customers recently implemented a policy forcing employees to come in twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And that policy was implemented a month ago. And the feedback from employees after implementing that policy was, what they found was that employee satisfaction, employee morale was at its lowest point ever. And Also, there was also a high an uptick in employees considering leaving the company, and there was direct attribution back to the policy change of forcing people to come in twice a week to their HQ. And their HQ is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever seen. It's got every amenity you can imagine plus more. You wouldn't want to ever leave if if you were perhaps living next door to the HQ and not having to commute in, or not coming in and not being on a Zoom call for 8 hours of the day, and really didn't accomplish any of those serendipitous moments or water cooler moments that you might have experienced in the past, because your agenda is packed with connecting with people through your computer. And so, but that example I just shared is fairly common, not only in tech, but also across a number of different industries. And there's a lot of friction that exists at the moment between executives of companies wanting their employees to be together for the reasons we talked about, and for the investment that they make into their real estate to provide value to their employees. It's a sunk cost. It's an ongoing operational cost that's really high. They want to make sure they get value. Now, that's where we are today. And I think we're seeing this play out almost predictably, that, just like the example I shared, employees are not satisfied with that type of mandate, if you will, to try to come into the HQ. And, a lot of people too also moved away from their headquarters and are living in other areas now that make it difficult for them to even come in the first place. And that's creating all sorts of interesting HR challenges in terms of how do you start to categorize employees based on decisions that they've made around where they want to live. So all that being said, we're seeing this play out. It's predictable that there's friction, there's pushback. Another one of our customers was forcing their employees to come in 5 days a week, right? Never change their policy. It's expected you come in, very Musk-like. You if you're an employee of this company, if you don't show up, you're basically resigning. And just 2 weeks ago, that company has backed off that policy and is going to be implementing flexible working arrangements, delegating the decision on when people should be coming into the office with their team managers, right? So while you've got some companies kind of just as recently a month ago forcing people to come back, another company who was experimenting with or living through 5 days a week is now come to the realization that their employees aren't happy. These are all kind of sequencing and playing out very predictably. And what I think is the trend is very much in alignment with what you believe will happen, is that corporations will downsize their HQ. I think HQs might not necessarily go away in the near future, but they will be definitely downsized in the near future. And with the savings that real estate teams achieve through downsizing their HQ footprint, some companies are in a better position to do that than others. They'll start to think about, how do we leverage micro satellite spaces, especially in metropolitan areas like where I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we can push space closer to where people live to give them an option to meet in person that's equipped with all of the security and IT requirements that the corporation has. And that, I believe, is going to be the trend, especially in metropolitan areas. And that lines up really well with what employees want too, is I don't want to sit in the car like I did this morning for over an hour to come into the office. And my intention of coming into the office should be more about making those in-person connections and building those bonds and creating the cultural well-being of the company. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to force everybody into one location. So companies are going to get smart about this. It's going to take some time for that transition to happen. It's not imminent because we're still seeing these, forcing people coming back, learning that employees are unhappy, maybe losing some employees. Oh, we better course correct and let's think about a more flexible approach. This is too hard to manage at a top-down level. Let's delegate to team managers. Team managers then become responsible for making those decisions with, guidance from HR on trying to facilitate in-person meetups. And then real estate is going to basically follow suit and start to think about how they support that angle with more satellite spaces, and especially in metropolitan areas.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I know Amazon was the first company, at least to publicly state maybe a year or something ago, that they were going to put the responsibility on individual managers to decide. And I remember whatever the episode was that I recorded around that time, I was up in arms. Like, that's just the absolute worst decision. Though culturally as a company, coming from the idea, of not even the issue of second-class citizens between people who are on-site versus off-site, but you may have one manager who hit the ground well, was able to transition, was able to be intentional how they run a team, and is able to lead a team remotely. Great. And they're like, hey, work remote, do whatever you want. And you have another team where the person didn't have the training, didn't have the upskills, still having trouble kind of figuring it out, pushing more to be back in the office. And you have two different kind of cultures, two different expectations. And I can imagine if I were on the team that was supposed to come back to the office, I'd be like, I don't want to work on this team. I'm going to go work for this person. So now you have potentially competing cultures and competing experiences within each individual team, because the company leadership should be the one making the decision, saying, here's what we're doing across the board, make it fair and obviously equitable to everybody, versus putting in individual managers who may have had a great experience of remote, maybe hadn't had a great experience of remote. And so I'm not much of a fan of that. But one of another points moved to a little bit different direction. So the idea of a tool like HiFive is to give the individual employees the opportunity, to build relationships, to kind of build engagement amongst ourselves. But how does a tool like HiFive give the company itself the opportunity? Because, right, the effort and the work of building engagement, at least for now, in the future we'll see, should be more on the company itself versus the individual employees. So seeing, okay, in the specific space, we have, 40 people coming in next Thursday. Like, how can a company that sees the 40 people coming into the office next Thursday, like, what can they do with it? And what should they be doing with that data and that knowledge that they get using the product like HiFive?
That's an interesting question. And I don't think we have the answers to that yet, because we're just starting to collect this data and starting to surface it to the people who are responsible then for their, the HR, their people, or workplace teams, the space. They haven't actually been able to, aside from knowing when people are coming into the office, they haven't been able to know other aspects of why they're coming in, who they're meeting with, what type of meetings are they having while they're here, what space did they end up using. All of the triangulation of understanding the holistic picture is not something yet that we've stitched together. And nobody in the market really has stitched together that holistic picture for HR and real estate teams. So, but, we've of course spoken with those buyers of real estate teams and HR teams. And we know that understanding employee behavior and the motivations and intentions of why they use space can help prepare them, and at a high level, with supporting the environments, the types of activities that are happening from kind of a top-down perspective, right? It gives them an opportunity to react to something based on the intelligence that they've collected. That ends up being more event-based, though, right? It's more, corporate teams are better at the planning of an event or the planning of a change of space or things like, that are a reaction to what they've learned. What we believe is critical, and this is the role of HiFive, is that facilitating in real life connections is happening organically. It needs to happen organically. It needs to be something that is, again, back to the desire to create a continuous flow of somebody's day, regardless of their personal and professional commitments, is ultimately what we're wanting to help achieve for people, so that they have those connections, they have those serendipitous moments, they have those the experiences that create a connection with each other, and to and in a space that is conducive to their meetings. And it's that fluid, organic, changing dynamic that happens on a week-to-week basis, which is the real hard part. If you've solved that problem, the data will inform corporate and HR, real estate teams and HR teams with how to better align the resources and the things that they can do in terms of changing space, in terms of creating measurements or understandings of using the data to understand whether somebody is at risk or lonely, using the data to facilitate proactive measures to reach out to people, creating social events that are in alignment with the people who are coming in and what their preferences are. Those end up being kind of top-down responses to this, the data that you're collecting, which needs to happen, or the connections and the fluidity of your week needs to happen organically. So we're not, with HiFive, we're not prioritizing that at the moment, right? We want to solve the problems that are preventing people from getting together. We solve that problem, then the data that we collect is undoubtedly going to be of value to those teams. And what they do with that data, I think, simply put, we're not quite sure yet, aside from these high-level ideas that I just shared. But we know that it's going to be extremely valuable to them, more so than what they're able to collect today from just understanding how their space is being used, or doing surveys with their employees, a one-time, response to a set of questions. And that those end up being very limited. And this is going to really give them a clear picture of what improvements they can make.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spoken to a couple other companies we had also on the podcast building similar tools, and I think that was also one of my points, that like the whole space utilization, like that's not so much as value. I think what you had mentioned, the point of events, right? If we understand that people are coming in for social opportunities and relationship building, if you saw, hey, 40 people are coming to the office, that should be maybe a trigger of, hey, let's do a pizza party. Let's do some kind of event funding the office. Or we saw maybe many of them or most of them were parents. Maybe let's do a bring your kid to school, bring your kid to work day, and get a clown or some kind of fun things for kids. Like the unlock that this data gives to a team of, again, we know the reason why people are coming in is not to do work. They're coming in to be social, relationship building. So we understand that, and we understand who's there. Then we, the company, can then take advantage of, okay, how do we give more ways to those people who are coming in the opportunity to connect and relationship build and have fun, because that's certainly the point that they're coming into. And I think for a product like this or similar, like that's going to be the big unlock for the company. It's, hey, we have this data. We know who's coming in, when they're coming in theory, maybe why they're coming, or what about the people. And let's do something about it. Let's make it a rewarding experience. So they had a good time. They enjoyed themselves. Okay, maybe they'll want to come in next time versus, okay, I'm not coming back again.
Yes. Anything that you create that tighter connection, right, is going to be critical longer term for companies to continue to evolve their workplace, their policies, how they're measuring employee engagement, and all of that's changing. And the only way that you can make informed decisions is by understanding people's preferences, their behaviors, and surfacing that in connection with other metrics that they're measuring. And when we get to that point, there are going to be some interesting ideas that probably we haven't even thought of yet, and how companies can create environments and culture that ultimately serves their people better.
Yeah. So my next question is, we alluded to, and we spoke about it briefly before, this idea of, again, understanding that the office is not the place where work gets done in the future. The companies that are using the product, and maybe Siemens alike, is there work already being done to actually physically redesign the office? Now, I think Salesforce and Atlassian are probably the two most famous companies that have kind of completely redesigned their headquarters, again, moving away those desks and kind of small spaces and focusing much more on opportunities for people to kind of sit together and have fun together and build relationships together. For the companies, again, that you're working with, and maybe even Siemens, are you hearing like this come up, or people thinking about this? Are they already starting to make changes or starting to plan changes yet?
Yes, for sure. And I would say that, you mentioned Salesforce, Atlassian. There are other companies in the tech space that probably would be in the category of innovators in that area, and therefore they're making investments to change space. One of the use cases that came up during the pandemic was neighborhoods. So how do we start to divide up space to support team collaboration? And let's think about a neighborhood as being a different space configuration that would support more collaboration type scenarios, right? Where you've got bigger space, more whiteboards, cameras. So there's the best tech to make employees who are remote feel connected to the people who are in the room. Fewer desks, and even bringing other amenities like cafeterias, mini kitchens close to those neighborhoods. We've seen things like that. But not only in tech, there have been some companies outside of tech, financial services, that are experimenting with this. And I think we're going to see more of it. We're going to definitely see, just in our office right now, I'm sitting in a room that used to be an office. It used to have a desk. It used to be used by one person, and now it's a set of chairs, a sofa, and a little table, like a coffee table in the middle of the space. So very low cost way of creating a space here that is more meeting oriented. I have a whiteboard on the other side of my computer here, and behind me, of course, you see a monitor. That was a cheap way of changing this space to align with how people are thinking about using the space now that there's no need for somebody to be in this office 8 hours a day. Low cost thing that we did, much more expensive investments that some other companies have made to change spaces. I saw one of them recently, reconfiguring walls and creating more stand-ups, tables that you can scribble on, and, modern tech that I was mentioning around how to then facilitate remote employees to connect with their people in the office. Those are few and far between at the moment, but I know a lot of real estate professionals are considering those. It's just that, when do you pull the trigger on that? Because if you build it, will they come? I think what we're starting to see is that if you build it, they might not necessarily come, because you're not really solving those upstream problems, right? This ends up being yet another amenity that is proven to not move the needle. So I think while we have those innovators doing some really interesting, cool things, the mainstream market of real estate teams, they're not going to make those investments until they start to see people coming back into the office more regularly. And that's not going to happen until you start to solve those upstream problems to make the value of coming into the office really apparent to them. And at the same time, making it easy for them to make those decisions.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And company leaders trying to understand that redesigning a space still with a focus on work, that's certainly not the answer. Again, because that's obviously why people aren't, or that's not with the purpose of the offices. And I think even like the idea of the tech, I know this was a popular discussion certainly during the pandemic, of multiple people, and let's say in a conference room, and individual people on a Zoom call, where I'm much of a believer, even if you're physically in a space, everyone should have the same real estate, right? Everyone should be on the same Zoom box or whatever tool you have. So everyone has the same inclusion, has the same access. If you have a bunch of people in a space that are whiteboarding, doing things like that, how did the remote feel? I mean, I would feel like a second class citizen. Hey, those people there, they're listening to each other, not really listening to me. Maybe if I'm the leader or I'm the manager, they kind of have to listen to me. But if not,
right,
am I really going to be engaged? Yeah. So last question I have for you for today is maybe if you can share for the hybrid leaders who are listening to this podcast today when it comes out, what are the top 3 things that they should be thinking about around ensuring that they are able to keep their employees happy and engaged within a hybrid environment?
I think first and foremost, don't assume that you have all the answers at an executive level, and instead empower your team managers to do what's right for their employees. You have to give them some guidance on expectations, but you also have to empower them to facilitate that. Now, the empowerment at the moment is challenging, and so therefore, tools like HiFive that can help team managers facilitate this more easily will become imperative for hybrid companies to make hybrid works successful when you're delegating responsibility of that guidance to your team leaders. So I think that's really an important point. We talked about it earlier, joked about it as well too, that Amazon was one of the first to kind of delegate this down to team managers. I fundamentally believe that that's the right approach, because it's not something that could be managed at a corporate level. And so how do you support that is going to be an important question for them. So that's the top thing that I would do. I would also think about not only your location specific needs, but your human centric, right? So shift the mindset from location to what's best for the person. And what's best for the person is listening to their individual preferences and intentions, and trying to accommodate that in a as empathetic way as you can to make sure that they're not feeling forced or feeling that they're having to make a significant amount of sacrifices for the benefit of meeting others when if you're forcing people there, it might backfire, right? So you got to listen to your employees, and that means understanding their individual preferences. So I think that's, location centric versus human centric. Get away from this location centric mindset. Focus more on your employees and what they want. Make it easy for them to, because there is a desire to meet in person, but it doesn't need to be at a specific location. It can be more fluid than that. And I think that's, over time, as we talked about, that's where you're going to start to see this pendulum shift from large HQs to microsatellite spaces. The third recommendation that I would give is more centered around employee satisfaction and culture, and rethinking how you measure that, with the backdrop of some employees being permanently remote, some people being co-located to a space, some employees preferring to come in regularly. How do you start to, rather than making broad strokes of what our employee satisfaction, morale is, their connection to the workplace, their engagement, I think all of those more HR-centric metrics need to be reconsidered or redefined, is a better word, in the context of hybrid work, so that you're avoiding any preferential treatment based on location. You're creating a more inclusive environment, and you're avoiding employees feeling lonely or disconnected and ultimately leaving. And I think we've witnessed a little bit of that over the course of the pandemic. The Great Resignation. That was, I think, when we look back at that and analyze the data, my belief is most of that came from people just not feeling connected to their employees, their company, and just taking the next best offer. And then also we're starting to see it now with this new trend that the media is calling quiet quitting, where, because of that lack of engagement and that loneliness, it ends up, causing people to not feel engaged. And so HR teams are wrapping their arms around this, and I think they're going to have to think about their KPIs, their ways of measuring that differently going forward, and using data like what we talked about, intention, preference data, actual behavioral data, to better respond to their employee needs with measurements that are more in line with hybrid work use cases. So those would be the three things that I would recommend to anyone who is considering implementing a hybrid policy or is in the middle of it as well too, and just challenge with some of the do's and don'ts.
I love it. For everybody listening who may want to get a hold and in touch with you, learn a little bit more about HiFive, maybe test out the app, what's the best way to get a hold of you, to get a hold of HiFive, and to test it out?
Yeah, they should go to hifive.us and US, and it's a play on words there. It's not just based in the US. It's HiFive Us. And there they'll find the application. They'll be able to sign up, start using it, jump right into it. And we're excited to have as many users on our application to provide us with feedback. Of course, if you want to reach out to me individually and not just start using the application, you can find me on LinkedIn. The only other Franco Castaldini on LinkedIn is a real estate agent, so I'm the other guy, and would love to connect with you on these types of topics. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Though I guess somewhat you're involved in real estate as well, but look for the Franco who's more involved in HiFive. Franco,
right.
Thanks so much for joining and sharing your knowledge and experience, and really helping define because I mean, this, at least for me, is going to be the big unlock for hybrid. Again, giving in essence no reason why people should go in, and really giving that sense of who's going to be there, because that's, again, that's the motivating factor. People are going in to meet other people and to do coffees and lunches and whatever maybe the company hopefully is organizing. So giving an easy tool where people can kind of organize and really understand when's it good for me to go in and when's not good for me to go in. And something I guess maybe we didn't ask, maybe I'll kind of throw it in there. And I'm a big believer, especially as we move forward with remote and certainly hybrid, that the connections will really need to be based, especially when everyone maybe isn't necessarily coming in the same day. And most connections we have today tend to be people on your core team that you work with on a regular basis. But how do we bridge those? How do we build relationships on outside teams that you don't interact with? And I think that for me, that's going to be the big unlock, and really going to be connected to interests, like shared mutual interests, and I don't know, hiking or rafting or crocheting or what have you. And that having maybe potentially that ability where you can, again, maybe create groups, right? Maybe do a hike group. You know, if you have an office, maybe in the mountains somewhere, I don't know the terrain there so well, but maybe there is like, hey, let's do a hiking day, or maybe 2 days a week. These people come in to the office that day because, hey, they do a hike at lunch or something like that. I think it's really, really exciting area.
Oh yeah, you're spot on. And that's one of the things that we want to see happen with our application, is make it really easy for people to start to make connections outside of their immediate contacts. And that's really when the magic happens, and you start to see the benefits of employee engagement, morale starting to go up. Because you know what? We're human beings. We love to be around other human beings, most of us. And I think that is healthy for all of us. Improved mental health, improved productivity, improved connections, engagement, all of that are good things.
Absolutely. So good. Franco, again, thank you so much for joining today. Appreciate the conversation. And for everyone who's listening,
Thank you,
until next time, have a wonderful day, everybody.